Shining Bright Lotus. And welcome, everyone. Taking a pause just to look around and look at all the folks I know and new folks. Welcome all those who I've not met before. We are going to take a 6-week adventure it's interesting. It's an adventure because of Junpo Roshi's teaching with the wisdom of his students, I would say. I'm just thinking about it now. I think that Junpo is trying to solve a really important problem of how Buddhism, I would say, land and is utilized in 21st century American and European and Canadian culture. I mean, worldwide, but pretty much Western. And Kogan Keith Martin Smith, who will be the last speaker of this series, I think served as a vital mouthpiece to help interpret Junpo's wisdom in a way that we can make more sense of. So When the Buddha Needs Therapy is the third book that Kogan, I'll just call him Kogan, Keith Martin Smith, wrote with Junpo, the first being Junpo's biography, A Heart Blown Open, the second being The Heart of Zen, which really articulated Mondo Zen. And this third one is really like, yeah, but there's something really special here, right? And that special has to do with articulating how emotional development and emotional trauma and pain are very vastly and much different and need to be addressed within a Buddhist context, and how the traditional teachings on it tend to bypass it. So, since we now have more understanding of both psychology and Buddhism, actually, we can blend those two things to end up with when the Buddha needs therapy, which is, you could say, is when is it appropriate for me to meditate, and when is it appropriate for me to seek some kind of counseling and therapeutic process in which I can make more sense of my experience. Okay, so where he starts with is with identity. And that's actually kind of a useful topic because we're in a great era of identity politics. Actually, we're in an era of identity politics collapsing, but that's another conversation that we'll not have today. But it's actually a really useful piece for spirituality, because let's back up, and it's like, how do I identify with my spirituality? Instead of saying spiritual identity, ask the question, how do I identify with my spirituality? Okay. Or how is my practice, my faith, my understanding of the cosmos part of my identity? That's a question actually you'll all get to talk about. So I will speak for another 15, 20 minutes, and then we're going to go into small groups and ask you all to actually have a chance to share with each other, because that's kind of how we organize this. So it's not just about me giving you some nugget of wisdom. It's about us exploring identity and spirituality. So, Kogan basically defines spirituality as, the search for the sacred. We could get into a whole sense of what spiritual means, what sacred means, but I think it is important to unpack a couple of key terms like religion versus spirituality. And apparently, according to most polls these days, actually, interestingly, America has a exceedingly high percentage of people, more so than almost all the European cultures, who identify themselves as religious, were actually all those folks who came over from Europe in the 16th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century were usually were being persecuted and came here to find a place to practice. So we're a very religious culture. And then, of course, in the 20th century, people kind of rebel against religion, but then there's this void. And so we have a large percentage of folks who identify themselves as spiritual, but not religious. Okay. Well, we got both. We also have this wonderful phenomenon that because Buddhism doesn't really believe in God, there's no God in religion. I would say, if you want to give it a good image, it's a God-shaped hole. Okay. So it's like there's no God, but there is a belief in some larger notion of the cosmos, even if you could say we can't really describe it. Right. I think many know I'm Jewish. The Jews would say you can't describe it either, in the sense that there's no word for God. You can't have a name for God. So you have all these names that are not the name of God that point at God. And so in Buddhism, we have all these words that point at this thing that we can't talk about, but we have to. So we give it terms like pure awareness or clear, deep heart mind. Those are two terms that we use in our particular canon. Okay. So, but there's this really interesting term, and some people know this is one of my hankerings, called Buddhist modernism. And Buddhist modernism is sort of like, well, the way that Buddhism came to America, it has a bias, and it has a bias toward the modernistic perspective, and the modernistic perspective is very scientific. So it sort of rolls into America in this idea that it's not a religion. Because there's no God. But if you look at the way it's practiced by many folks, it certainly kind of looks like a religion. And if you go look at it the way it's practiced in Asia, where it comes from and where it's still thriving, it very much is a religion. So it's not really actually very accurate to say that being a Buddhist is not a religious practice. But here in the West, we definitely would prefer to say, no, I'm spiritual, but I'm a Buddhist and I'm not religious. And then you add on top of it the Zen version of it, and you put everybody in robes and you make them do all these religions and hit them with sticks, which we don't really do anymore. But you blow incense, and, or if you go into a Vajrayana or a Tendai temple, looks like you could be going into a church. It certainly is hard to argue that it's not a religion. And a lot of people are attracted to Buddhism because it doesn't have a God, and we can say to ourselves, well, I'm spiritual, I have a Buddhist practice. So what I'm pointing to is that it's kind of fuzzy, that whole thing. But let's just say religion is when I believe in a faith. I have a practice in the faith, and spirituality is, I'm not connected to any organized faith, but I have intuitive sense that there's something greater beyond myself. And I have a practice, or I do things in my life that allow me to greater access this sense of something beyond. How's that for a reasonable definition that's not a graduate school bibliographical reference definition? And what about all that? Okay. Well, interestingly, then I get into some psychology stuff. So some people have heard me talk about this one before too, but we have a habit of paying attention to three different classes or types of objects in our mind. Okay, so one of the first objects that we become in touch with are concrete objects. So a concrete object is this cup, which you can't really see because of my screensaver. Okay, this body is concrete, right? So I can have my spiritual practice be very much about concrete elements in it. So in religions, that is usually places, sometimes it's idols. And in our version of Buddhism, that's in the form. Can you do the form the right way? Can you honor the structure of what we do? right? So that's sort of saying if I practice my spirituality in a concrete way, right? I meditate regularly, I show up, I wear the proper clothing, I bow the right particular way, I sit the right way, I know how to chant. That's a very concrete approach to spirituality. And there's something very valid to it, but it's only one part of the puzzle. Okay, so that's the first object, concrete. The next object is subtle. So subtle is when well, you're listening to my voice. If you close your eyes for a second and just notice what arises, how you're feeling when I say boo. There's your emotional reactivity, right? Subtle is very much where thoughts and feelings arise, where ideas arise and concepts arise. So when we start talking about things like whether there's a self or a no self, or we start talking about things like suffering, then we're starting to talk about subtle objects. Let's back up oneself. Remember, I talked about identity? Well, identity has this too. I can have concrete identity things, like I really identify by the color of my skin or by the gender that I was born with. That's a very concrete notion of identity, right? I'm a white guy. It's very concrete. But a subtle perspective of identity is much more recognizing things like my faith or my culture, my tribe. So I think for me, identifying as a Buddhist, spiritual identity is much more of I don't identify as a concrete Buddhist, I identify as a subtle Buddhist. It's my belief that makes me a Buddhist. It's my beliefs. That's subtle. Okay, so that shows up in identity and it also shows up in spirituality. So most spirituality is very subtle. And for a lot of people, their first experience of this greater sense of self happens in nature. So a lot of people say, it's called nature mysticism. They have this experience of awe and wonder when they're out in an empty place. It's always an amazing thing. If anyone's ever been on a vision quest, if you strip everything away and just put yourself on the earth with nothing but the earth, it's amazing how amazing that is. It's very spiritual. It's very awakening. It's very lovely because there's something wonderful about this planet and this world that we live in. I said there were three objects. So the third object is this other kind of thing that is where we're getting into a very important part of Buddhism. And this is those language that you can't really use. But, well, when we stop all the thoughts and maybe we're out in nature, or maybe we're meditating, or maybe we're in a church, and we start to have a sense of something that is beyond the self, that's greater than the self, that's not my thoughts and feelings and sensations. Now we usually term the word that we use for this is awareness. Junpo liked to use the term pure awareness because awareness you can use in many different ways. You could also say the language awakened awareness is a nice way of qualifying that particular sense of awareness. So this is the third object. So folks start to have experiences of something beyond their thoughts, beyond their bodies. And that feeling often comes along with a sense that I'm not separate from everything else. Right. It's all the whole big everything, including the nothing and everything and the paradoxes. It's the whole bag of whole everything. So we're going to call that awareness. And so there is a way that we start to notice that people start to have more and more experiences of awareness in their life. In the system I'm using with the three objects, that's called meta-awareness. I'm aware of awareness. There's a lot of research being done by someone named Jeffrey Martin, who's the Finders, if you haven't seen that book, or a persistent non-symbolic experience. That's his term for pure awareness. I'll say it more slowly. Persistent non-symbolic experience. So that's when I'm having the experience that doesn't have any thoughts in it, non-symbolic. So I can't make concepts of it. It's just this. And so Martin's work, he went and interviewed lots of people, and he found out that actually it's not as uncommon as we think. And you don't have to be a Buddhist to have it. I'll say that again. It's not as uncommon as you think, and you don't have to be a Buddhist to have it. As a matter of fact, Jews have it, and Arabs have it, and Christians have it, and Muslims have it, and Javanese have it, and Burmese have it, and, Native Americans have it, because it's actually not a thing. If it's everything, that it kind of makes sense that there's lots of different ways of accessing it. He has another term for it. I'm just going to give you that term. He calls it fundamental well-being, which is the reason why he calls it fundamental well-being is because after interviewing lots of people, he found out that most people who start to have this experience of awareness, of spiritual awareness, of awakened awareness, seem to get a lot of wellness along with it. And that comes along as emotional wellness. There's a lot of resiliency that happens when you have this experience, because there's a sense of something greater than the self that you can trust and you can sink into. It's like, cool, I like this. So a lot of what we do, what brings people to our Sangha, but to any Sangha, is wanting to try and have this experience. In a formal Rinzai setting, the experience is called Kensho. Kensho's like, I get it. Right? Junpo used to say, do you get the joke? Goes along with fundamental well-being. But in Jeffrey Martin's system, it turns out that there's a lot of stages of how this particular happens. Some people get it when they're running marathons. Some people get it when they're in a church, right? There's a lot of ways people have glimpses of it when they take hallucinogenics. But it can be more stable, and you can actually work with it, and that's where you get a spiritual practice, right? So that's actually back to Kogan's book, because I'm a little off subject, but not really. Kogan talks about spiritual practice. So how does this all relate to what we're doing, and how do we make sense of it? Is so as we mature, we become increasingly more and more aware of these subtler and subtler objects. We can learn more about these subtler and subtler objects, or this meta-aware. It's not really an object of this meta-awareness. And then that can actually begin to inform the way we show up in the world. Okay, so it's not really a system. Buddhism to me is not offering us an idea. It's like, well, when I go meditate, then I'm doing my thing, and when I'm done, I'm just the same as I'm always. It's like, no, the meditation never stops. You're actually building a body and a life that includes understanding of concrete things, of subtle, and of meta-aware. They're all here, right? And we're all practicing, right? And we continue to grow. We can get kind of caught up in it. And so then the identities start to be something that kind of limits us. And that's because our minds have a habit of getting all excited and holding on to things. And so Kogan does talk about in this first and second chapter, the challenges of wearing your robe of liberation in a way that is not consistent with the actual notion of all things are impermanent. There is no self, right? Or anatta, anatma, no self principles. With that said, the historical Rinzai practice spent much more time transcending the self and had a habit of not including it. So Junpo's 21st century Zen is saying, well, let's work on the transcendence, let's meditate, let's do all these practices, but let's not forget that self that is not permanent, that we still walk around in and eats and sleeps and does all that stuff, also needs to mature and grow up and show up. And so how can we utilize our Buddhist practice to help us with maturing? And for that, he came up with emotional koans. That's what he came up with. If you look around, go Google it sometime. There just aren't any other emotional koans out there. There's only Junpos. There's people who work with emotions because they do that in Mahamudra practice and lots of other Buddhist practices. But from a koan perspective, they're very unique. So if you bump into the kind of real traditional Rinzai folks and they say, well, those aren't real koans, what they mean is those aren't traditional Rinzai koans. Those are something innovative. They're 21st century emotional koans. So we're not here to talk about that, but that's just to say that's the technology Junpo invented in order to help us understand or work with that self that shows up. And it is a matter of recognizing that when we get triggered, that's the best opportunity to remember and choose that we're not separate. I'll say that again. When we get triggered, when we have an emotional response that's familiar to us, to what's happening in the world, that's the great moment to recognize with compassion for ourselves and others. What are the circumstances that arose? And how can I show up skillfully, upaya, for myself and others? So it's fundamentally an interpersonal practice. He also talks about practice in this particular chapter, spiritual practice when the Buddha needs therapy. And this is my last thought. And then I'm going to go into small groups, or I'm going to go back to Mingpo. And I want to just remind us that once again, what we inherit in Buddhist modernism is, well, Buddhism is meditation practice. So if you go to Vipassana, that's the primary emphasis. We meditate a lot. In case you didn't know this, not all Buddhisms meditate a lot. As a matter of fact, a lot of Buddhisms don't meditate a lot. Some do. Okay, Zen does. Okay, so it's not like it's particular. Zen is about meditating a lot. But like, for instance, if you go to a Mahamudra retreat, it's not even a silent retreat. You're only silent during the meditations. Okay, you are silent if you go to a Vipassana retreat. So they're all different. But there are actually three elements to Buddhist practice. So there's meditation, which is that commitment towards silencing the self so that you can become more reliably engaged and in the meta-aware perspective. There is the ethical practice, which is very actually much not different from religions. If you look at our precepts, they're not really that much different than the Ten Commandments, but we study the ethical practice so we can show up in the world in a wise, skillful manner. And then we also study sutra, or we study the text, the actual, the context for it. And that's actually a bigger deal in Zen than we like to believe, because Zen has this sort of language that there is no text to Zen, so it's all about sudden awakening. But then it turns around and gives you thousands of pages of text to understand in order for that to work out successfully. Okay, so it's its own little paradox. So we said we have meditation, we have ethical practice, and we have sutra study. You could say sutra study is studying the Dharma. Conveniently, meditation is a first-person practice, and ethics is a second-person practice, and sutra study is a third-person practice. Very convenient, right? Holistic thinking. That goes all the way back. If you go to a Goenka, retreat sometime, which I highly recommend, he'll say that, and he'll say Buddha's been saying that for about, Buddha was 2,500 years ago. So that's an old thought. Okay. So once again, so the spiritual identity that we're accepting, we're holding, and we're transcending is not just a meditation practice. It's also how we show up and how we understand the context for ourselves in the world. And in that particular way, to me, what gives me the most faith is that identity is really about relieving suffering. However innumerable all beings are, I vow to serve and liberate them all. I mean, the point of it is, so it's like I can have a spiritual practice, but why are we doing it in the first place? And in that sense, this whole story that Junpo and Kogan are bringing to us is about the Mahayana, the bodhisattva vow, and about relieving suffering in others. So I sit on my cushion every day to help all beings. And I pay attention to how I act in the world so that my actions can be as supportive to others as possible. And I'm totally fascinated by this literature because it's amazing how many people have been doing this for a long time. And there's a lot of wisdom out there to share. And so I get to bathe in it by understanding the Dharma and the wisdom. So I'm getting to where I'm about to close up. So today I just introduced the idea of spiritual identity, separated a little bit about religion and spirituality, even though I probably just made it muddier because I dispelled the idea that Buddhism is not a religion. And I know that a lot of people are attracted to, us and Buddhism in general are not coming to it because they want to be in a religion. They want to be in a practice. And in that way, Buddhism really is the way is a practice. And so this is all on the way to moving toward separating when the work is coming up is ego and when is it about waking up, ego, and then it becomes about growing up. And you're going to get a lot more about it as each week another teacher is going to come along and share as we move toward Kogan's final words, where he actually gives us a wonderful simplified practice. And it's all about including this self right here, right now, and recognizing that all these selves are on here. How many are there? 16 of us. But it's Zoom amazing. We're not separate from all across the planet. So I thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to connecting. Shining Bright Lotus.